Deep in the rugged wilderness of the San Juan Mountains near Pine Hollow, Colorado, an abandoned hunting cabin stood hidden among thick forests of spruce and towering pine trees. The road that led to it was little more than a narrow dirt trail filled with potholes and mud. Few travelers ever came this far into the mountains, especially during the cold autumn season when storms rolled through the valleys without warning. The cabin had clearly been built many years ago. Its walls were made of thick hardwood logs, carefully fitted together by skilled hands long ago. The roof rose high above the ground, strong enough to withstand heavy snowfall and mountain winds. Even though the cabin had been empty for a long time, it still looked sturdy and well-built, like a small fortress standing quietly in the middle of the wilderness. A dusty pickup truck rolled slowly up the dirt road and stopped near the cabin. The driver stepped out and studied the building in silence. The man's name was Raymond Whitaker, though most people simply called him Ray. Among a very small and secretive community of hunters, Ray Whitaker was known as one of the most experienced werewolf hunters in the country. He had spent years traveling across remote towns and mountain regions, tracking creatures most people believed were only myths. Ray stood still for a moment, studying the cabin carefully. The location had been recommended to him by a local member of the Hunter Guild, an underground network that quietly monitored supernatural threats. According to the contact, the cabin had been empty for years and would make a perfect temporary base. Ray pushed open the wooden door and stepped inside. The cabin's main room was large and open. The smell of old wood and dust hung in the air, but the place was surprisingly clean. Whoever had arranged the cabin had done a decent job preparing it for his arrival. Ray walked slowly through the room, checking the walls, the windows, and the corners. Everything seemed safe. There were no broken boards or signs of animals nesting inside. The place would serve its purpose. He moved to the fireplace and began stacking pieces of firewood into the old brick hearth. The wood had already been chopped and piled nearby. Within minutes he had a neat stack ready to burn. Once he finished with the firewood, Ray began unpacking his equipment. He pulled a long black duffel bag onto the wooden table near the window. Inside were two rifles designed for hunting dangerous predators. The first rifle had a smooth walnut finish and a bolt-action mechanism. The second rifle was larger and painted in camouflage colors, built for powerful shots against large targets. Ray placed both rifles carefully on the table. Next he opened another bag filled with magazines and ammunition. He laid them out neatly beside the guns. Years of hunting had taught him that preparation meant survival. After that, he checked the rest of the cabin. The previous visitor had left several useful supplies behind. There were candles, canned food, a sleeping bag, cooking pots, and a small gas burner for heating meals. A pile of emergency equipment had also been arranged near the wall. Ray noticed something unusual on the windowsill. A small vase held a few fresh wildflowers. The bright yellow petals stood out against the rough wooden interior of the cabin. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Someone had clearly prepared this place for him with care. Before he could think more about it, a sound broke the silence. His burner phone began to ring. Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out the small prepaid flip phone. The number on the screen was familiar. He answered and sat down in a wooden chair near the fireplace. A woman's nervous voice spoke through the phone. "Hello, Mr. Whitaker? I just wanted to make sure you found the cabin." "I did," Ray replied calmly. "Oh good," the woman said quickly. "I left a few supplies for you. There's supposed to be a big storm coming, so I wanted to make sure you were comfortable." Ray looked around the room again. "Everything's fine," he said. The woman sounded relieved. "It's really an honor to have someone of your reputation here in Pine Hollow," she continued. "You're one of the best hunters the guild has." Ray remained quiet, listening. She then suggested something. "If you're free tomorrow, maybe we could meet for a drink in town. I could show you around." Ray considered the offer for a moment. "Sure," he said. "Send me the address." Her voice brightened. "Great. There's a bar in town with good burgers." Then her tone changed slightly. "Did you receive the photos I sent you earlier?" "I did," Ray replied. "The girl in the photo, she looks like someone who lives here in Pine Hollow," the woman explained carefully. "I'm not completely sure, but she looks familiar." Ray leaned back in his chair. That caught his attention. If the girl truly lived in Pine Hollow, she could lead him exactly where he needed to go. "Let's talk more tomorrow," Ray said. "Maybe you can help arrange a meeting." "I'll try," the woman replied. After a short pause, the call ended. Ray lowered the phone and stared quietly into the empty fireplace. A deep growl sounded beside him. On the floor near the fire lay three enormous dogs. They were not ordinary hunting dogs. Each one weighed well over 100 pounds and had thick coats designed to survive mountain winters. Ray had raised them himself. The largest dog, Brutus, looked almost like a small bear with dark fur and heavy muscles. Next to him lay Ranger, a leaner dog with a long snout and sharp eyes. Ranger was the fastest of the three and an expert tracker. Closest to Ray sat Daisy, the only female of the group. She was slightly smaller but far more alert than the others. Her intelligent eyes followed Ray's every movement. Ray reached down and scratched Daisy behind the ears. "You're still the boss?" he muttered. These dogs had been trained for one purpose: werewolf hunting. For years Ray had mixed small amounts of wolfsbane into their food and water. The poison had slowly adapted their bodies. Their blood and flesh had become toxic to werewolves. A human hunter might struggle to keep up with a werewolf through the forest, but his dogs could track a pack across the mountains for days. Ray stood and stretched his back before walking to the wall. From another bag he pulled several printed photographs and pinned them up. Most of them were wildlife photos he had taken himself. Birds, trees, and landscapes. They served as a perfect cover story if anyone asked what he was doing in the mountains. Finally he pinned up one last photograph. This one was different. It showed a large man walking along a hiking trail deep in the forest. The image was partially blocked by tree branches, but the man's build was unmistakable. Strong shoulders. Tall frame. Behind the man, hidden among the leaves, was a young red-haired woman. Ray crossed his arms and stared at the picture. He had seen many werewolves during his career. Something about this man felt different. Stronger. Older. More dangerous. Ray was certain of it. The man in the photograph was an alpha werewolf. His mind returned to the recent guild report that had brought him here. 5 men had been found dead in the woods outside Pine Hollow. Their bodies were torn apart, and the police believed wolves had attacked them. But Ray knew better. There were no wolf packs in these mountains. Only werewolves. And if an alpha truly lived nearby, then this hunt could become the greatest victory of his entire career. Ray studied the photo once more. He didn't need to find the alpha immediately. He only needed to find the girl. The red-haired woman would lead him straight to the monster. Heavy rain poured down over Pine Hollow, Colorado, on a dark and gloomy October morning. Thick gray clouds hung low above the mountains, covering the sky like a heavy blanket. The tall pine trees that surrounded the town swayed in the cold wind, their branches dripping with rainwater. The roads were slick and shining, reflecting the dull light of the cloudy sky. Just off the highway stood the Timberline Diner, one of the busiest spots in the small mountain town. A large wooden sign with the image of a grizzly bear hung above the entrance, welcoming travelers and locals alike. The diner was known throughout the region for its large breakfast portions and warm meals, especially on cold mornings like this. The gravel parking lot outside the diner was nearly full. Pickup trucks, SUVs, and a few older sedans sat parked in uneven rows as rainwater gathered in small puddles between them. Despite the miserable weather, people had still come out for breakfast. Inside the diner, the waiting area was crowded with customers. Families stood together near the entrance, shaking rain from their jackets. Some people chatted loudly while others complained about the long wait for a table. The smell of bacon, coffee, and fresh waffles drifted through the air. Standing near the hostess counter was Heather Whitmore. She pushed a damp strand of red hair behind her ear and leaned forward slightly as she spoke with the hostess. After giving their names, she stepped aside and looked around the crowded room. Beside her stood Jason Callahan. Heather glanced toward him briefly before looking away again. Even after everything that had happened recently, she still felt a little nervous standing next to him in public. Jason was taller than almost everyone in the room. His broad shoulders filled his jacket easily, and his presence seemed to draw attention even when he wasn't trying. Heather shifted her weight slightly as she waited for their table. The crowded lobby made her uncomfortable. People were standing close together, brushing shoulders as they moved through the narrow space. The noise of conversations and the constant movement made her chest feel tight. She exhaled slowly. Jason seemed to notice. Without saying anything, he gently reached for her hand and guided her toward the door. "Come on," he said quietly. Heather followed him outside. The moment they stepped through the door, the cool air hit her face. Rain was still falling steadily, but the wooden overhang of the diner's roof created a small dry space beside the building. Jason positioned them beneath the shelter, away from the crowd inside. Heather let out a small breath of relief. The sound of rain hitting the roof above them created a steady rhythm. Water streamed from the gutters and splashed onto the gravel below. For a moment they simply stood there together. Heather's thoughts slowly drifted backward to the events of 2 nights earlier. The Harvest Moon Festival. The memory rose clearly in her mind. The festival had been held just outside Pine Hollow at a small farm that opened its land every autumn for games and seasonal celebrations. Lanterns had hung from wooden posts, lighting the paths between the attractions. There were pumpkin stands, corn mazes, food stalls, and carnival-style games scattered across the property. Heather remembered walking through the festival with Jason that evening. One of the games had been a shooting gallery where players could try to knock down rows of cardboard targets. Jason had stepped up to the booth and picked up the rifle with an easy confidence. Heather remembered watching as he raised the gun. One shot. Then another. Every single target fell. The people nearby had cheered as he cleared the entire row without missing once. The prize booth owner handed Jason a large stuffed bear as a reward. Heather remembered laughing as he gave the toy to her. At the time, she had simply thought he was very good with a rifle. Now she realized something else. Jason wasn't just skilled. He was dangerous. Heather wrapped her arms around herself as she continued remembering. Jason slipped his arm gently around her waist as they stood under the overhang. His touch was warm despite the cold rain. Heather could feel the strength in his arm even through his jacket. His body felt solid and steady beside her. She glanced at him again. Jason's dark hair was pulled back loosely, and a few strands had fallen around his face from the rain. His sharp jawline and strong features gave him a rugged look that made him stand out in any crowd. Heather quickly looked away again. Being close to him like this still made her feel shy, especially after everything that had happened. Her thoughts drifted again to the terrible events that followed the festival. That night had changed everything. Heather remembered the moment clearly. The moment she discovered Jason was a werewolf. The memory made her stomach tighten. She had seen things that no normal person should ever see. She remembered the men from the Stone Ridge pack surrounding them. At first they had looked like ordinary men. But then something had changed. Their bodies had twisted and stretched. Their bones had cracked loudly as their shapes shifted. Fur burst through their skin as their faces stretched forward into snarling muzzles. Heather had watched in horror as they transformed into wolves. Real wolves. Large, vicious creatures with glowing eyes and sharp fangs. The memory still made her heart race. Then she remembered Jason. Jason had changed too. But his transformation had been different. His body had grown larger than the others. His fur had been dark and thick like midnight. His wolf form had towered above the others like a giant shadow in the forest. Heather could still see it clearly in her mind. The massive black wolf standing between her and the other wolves, protecting her. The fight that followed had been brutal. Jason had lunged at the other wolves with terrifying strength. His jaws snapped and his claws tore through them as they tried to attack. Heather remembered the sounds of the fight. The snarling. The crashing through the trees. The snapping of branches beneath their feet. Fear had taken control of her then. She had run. Her legs carried her blindly through the forest as panic filled her mind. She hadn't known where she was going. She only knew she needed to escape. But Jason had followed. He had chased her through the dark woods until he caught up with her. Heather closed her eyes briefly as the final memory surfaced. That night. The forest. The moment when fear had slowly turned into something else. Something intense and confusing. Something she had never experienced before. They had ended up sleeping together there in the woods. Heather swallowed slowly as the memory faded. Now, standing outside the diner in the cold rain, she struggled to understand what had truly happened. Her mind kept questioning everything. Had it really happened? Had she truly seen men transform into wolves? Had Jason really become that enormous black wolf she remembered? Or had fear and darkness played tricks on her mind? Heather looked up at Jason again. He stood calmly beside her, watching the rain fall across the parking lot. He looked completely normal. Just a man standing outside a diner on a rainy morning. But Heather remembered something else. The moment when the massive black wolf had stood over her in the forest, protecting her from the other wolves. She could still see the animal's glowing eyes staring down at her, guarding her, watching over her. And somehow, deep down, Heather knew the truth. That wolf had been Jason. Heather Whitmore woke slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The room around her was dim and quiet. Thick shadows filled the corners, and the gray light coming through the window made everything look dull and colorless. It felt early, though she couldn't see a clock nearby. Then she heard it. Rain. Heavy rain pounded against the windows and roof of the house. The steady drumming echoed through the quiet room, mixing with the distant sound of wind pushing against the trees outside. Heather blinked and looked around. She was lying in a large bed covered in dark gray sheets. The room smelled faintly of wood and something warm and earthy she couldn't quite describe. Slowly her memories began to return. Jason's house. She was in Jason Callahan's house. Heather sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around herself as she tried to gather her thoughts. The sky outside the window was dark with storm clouds, making the room look almost like evening even though she knew it had to be morning. The events of the night before rushed back into her mind all at once. The Harvest Moon Festival. The woods. The terrifying moment when the men from the Stone Ridge pack had transformed into wolves. Heather swallowed as the memories grew clearer. Jason had changed too. But unlike the others, his transformation had been larger and more powerful. His body had stretched into the shape of a massive black wolf, far bigger than the other creatures surrounding them. She had seen it with her own eyes. Jason was not just a man. Jason was a werewolf. Heather lowered her head into her hands for a moment as the realization settled over her again. The thought still felt impossible. And yet she could not deny what she had witnessed. Her cheeks grew warm as another memory surfaced. After everything that happened in the woods, after the fight and the chaos, she and Jason had ended up alone together beneath the trees. Heather felt a slight ache in her body as she remembered what followed. She had lost her virginity that night. To him. The memory made her blush even though she was alone. Heather shifted carefully on the bed and winced slightly. A dull soreness lingered in her muscles from the night before. Her body still felt tired but not in a painful way. It was the kind of soreness that came after intense physical activity. She slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The air in the room felt cool against her skin. Heather noticed the faint scent of Jason everywhere around her. It clung to the blankets, the pillows, and even the clothes scattered nearby. The smell was strange but comforting at the same time. It reminded her of pine trees and fresh earth after rain. For a moment she simply stood there, letting the memories settle. Then she glanced down at her feet. Her eyes widened. Her ankle. The night before she had twisted it badly while running through the forest. The pain had been sharp and immediate, and she clearly remembered struggling to put weight on it. But now, Heather slowly lifted her foot and rotated her ankle. There was almost no pain. She touched the skin carefully. The swelling was gone. The bruising that had spread across her ankle the night before had nearly disappeared. Heather frowned in confusion. "That's weird," she muttered quietly to herself. To be sure, she shifted her weight onto the injured foot. Nothing. No sharp pain. No weakness. The ankle felt almost completely normal. Heather took a few careful steps across the room, testing it further. Her foot moved easily and the joint felt strong and stable. Her confusion deepened. There was no way an injury like that should heal overnight. She had twisted her ankle many times before during hiking trips around Pine Hollow. Normally the swelling lasted for days. Yet now it was almost completely gone. Heather stood still in the middle of the room, staring down at her foot. "How did that happen?" she whispered. The question had no simple answer. After a moment she shook her head and looked around the bedroom again. Her own clothes were nowhere in sight. Instead, a pile of Jason's clothing sat on a nearby chair. Heather hesitated for a second before picking up one of his hoodies. The garment was much larger than anything she normally wore. When she slipped it over her head, the sleeves hung past her wrists. Next she pulled on a pair of Jason's sweatpants. They were even bigger. The waistband hung loosely around her hips, and the legs bunched around her ankles. Heather had to roll them up slightly just to keep from stepping on the fabric. She looked down at herself and gave a small sigh. "I look ridiculous," she murmured. Still, the clothes were warm and comfortable. Heather pushed open the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet. Rain continued to pound against the roof as wind rustled through the trees outside. The hallway was dim, with only a little gray light slipping through the windows. "Jason?" she called softly. No answer. Heather walked slowly toward the bathroom. She flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The room remained dark. She tried the switch again. Still nothing. Heather frowned and stepped inside anyway. She turned the faucet handle at the sink, expecting water to flow out. But the pipes stayed silent. "No water either?" she said under her breath. She paused for a moment before remembering the storm outside. The heavy rain and strong winds must have knocked out the electricity. Power outages were common in mountain towns like Pine Hollow whenever storms hit the area. Without electricity, the house's well pump wouldn't work either. Heather sighed and left the bathroom. She continued exploring the house, moving quietly through the dim rooms. The living room was cozy, with a large couch facing a television mounted above a brick fireplace. The furniture looked simple but comfortable. Everything felt calm and peaceful despite the storm outside. Heather walked into the kitchen next. The room was neat and organized. A large refrigerator stood against one wall, and a wide sink sat beneath a window that looked out into the backyard. But Jason was nowhere in sight. Heather moved slowly through the house, checking each room. Empty. The living room. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. She stopped in the middle of the kitchen and listened carefully. The only sounds were the rain and the wind outside. Jason wasn't inside the house. Heather walked toward the back door and looked through the window. Beyond the glass she could see the backyard stretching toward a line of tall pine trees. Rain fell heavily across the grass, forming small puddles near the fence. Heather rested her hand on the door handle. Maybe Jason had gone outside. The thought made sense. He could be checking something in the yard or dealing with the storm. Heather stood there for a moment, staring through the rain-covered glass. Somewhere outside, beyond the trees and the falling rain, Jason Callahan was probably nearby. And Heather still had so many questions she didn't know how to ask. Heather Whitmore was still standing near the kitchen door when it suddenly opened. Cold rain blew inside as Jason Callahan stepped through the doorway. His dark jacket was soaked, and droplets of water rolled down his hair and shoulders. He pushed the door closed behind him quickly, shaking some of the rain from his sleeves. Heather hadn't expected him to come in so suddenly. The two of them nearly collided. "Oh!" Heather gasped as she stepped backward. Jason reacted immediately. His hands shot forward and grabbed her arms to steady her before she could lose her balance. For a brief moment they stood very close together in the middle of the kitchen. Jason looked down at her, his brow tightening slightly as he examined her. "You okay?" he asked. Heather nodded quickly. "I'm fine," she said. Jason's eyes shifted toward her feet. "What about your ankle?" he asked. Heather followed his gaze and glanced down at the foot that had been injured the night before. "It's actually fine," she said, sounding a little surprised even as she said it. Jason raised an eyebrow. "Fine?" Heather moved her ankle slightly, showing him. "It doesn't hurt anymore," she explained. "The swelling is basically gone." Jason seemed to study her carefully for a moment, as if thinking about something. Then he nodded slowly. "Good," he said. He stepped past her toward the kitchen sink and turned the faucet handle. Water began flowing immediately. Heather blinked in surprise. "The water's working again," she said. Jason glanced back at her. "I started the generator outside," he replied. "It'll keep the well pump running." Heather frowned slightly. "The generator?" Jason looked at her with mild disbelief. "You don't know what a generator is?" Heather shifted awkwardly. "I mean, I've heard of them," she admitted. "I just don't really know how they work." Jason folded his arms and leaned against the counter. "You've lived in the mountains your whole life and never used a generator?" Heather shrugged. "We don't lose power that often," she said defensively. Jason gave a small smirk. "Living out here without one is asking for trouble." Heather opened her mouth to argue, but something on the kitchen counter caught her attention. Her phone. She walked over and picked it up. The screen was cracked from when she dropped it during the chaos in the woods, and the battery was completely dead. "Well, that's not good," she muttered. Jason reached into a nearby drawer and pulled out a small device. It was a large portable battery pack. "Here," he said, handing it to her. Heather looked at it in surprise. "That thing looks huge." "It's meant for emergencies," Jason explained. "It'll charge your phone." Before she could figure out how to connect it, Jason gently took the phone from her hands. "Let me." He leaned forward slightly as he plugged the charging cable into the phone. Heather suddenly became very aware of how close he was. The scent of rain and pine clung to his clothes, mixed with the natural warmth of his skin. The smell surrounded her in a way that made her heart beat a little faster. Jason set the phone back on the counter once it was connected to the battery. Heather realized she had been staring. Jason noticed. A faint smile touched his lips. "You look comfortable," he said. Heather glanced down at the oversized hoodie and sweatpants she was wearing. "They were the only clothes I could find," she said. Jason stepped a little closer. "I like it," he said. Heather looked up at him again. "You do?" He nodded once. "Yeah." Then he leaned forward slightly and placed a soft kiss on her forehead. The gesture was gentle and warm. Heather felt her cheeks heat slightly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Jason's eyes studied her face carefully. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Heather hesitated before answering. "A little sore," she admitted. Jason's expression shifted into something more playful. "Well," he said lightly, "that happens when you lose your V-card." Heather's eyes widened. "Oh my God," she said, smacking his chest lightly. "Did you seriously just say that?" Jason laughed. "Just telling the truth." Heather shook her head, unable to stop a small laugh of her own. You're ridiculous. Jason leaned casually against the counter again. Then his expression became slightly more serious. Do you regret it? He asked. The question hung quietly between them. Heather thought about it for a moment. Everything that had happened felt overwhelming. The wolves, the fight in the woods, the strange discoveries about Jason's true nature. But when she looked at him now, standing calmly in front of her, she knew her answer. No, she said softly. I don't regret it. Jason seemed relieved. Good, he said. Then he reached down and grabbed the hem of his shirt. Take a look at this, he said. Heather watched as he lifted the fabric and turned slightly. Her eyes widened. Across his back and shoulders were long scratches and marks from the fight in the forest. Some of the wounds were deep enough that she could still see thin lines of dried blood. But what surprised her most was how much they had already healed. The cuts were closing. Bruises were fading. The injuries looked days old instead of fresh. Heather stepped closer, studying the marks carefully. That's incredible, she said. Jason lowered his shirt again. It's part of what we are, he explained. Heather folded her arms slightly, still amazed. You mean werewolves heal faster? Jason nodded. It's called vitality, he said. Heather tilted her head slightly. Vitality? Jason leaned back against the counter again. It's the same power that lets us change form, he explained. It also repairs our bodies quickly. Heather thought about her ankle again. The injury that had nearly disappeared overnight. Is that why my ankle healed so fast? She asked. Jason looked at her for a moment. It's possible, he said calmly. Heather felt a quiet chill run down her spine. The thought slowly formed in her mind. Something inside her might be changing too. And the more time she spent around Jason Callahan, the more real that possibility felt. Heather Whitmore leaned back slightly against the kitchen counter, her mind still spinning from everything she had learned. The quiet house around them seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Rain continued to fall outside, tapping steadily against the windows like a soft but persistent drum. Jason Callahan stood a few feet away from her, watching her carefully. Heather ran her fingers through her messy red hair and let out a slow breath. This is a lot, she said quietly. Jason didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Heather shook her head slightly as she tried to organize the storm of thoughts inside her mind. You're not just some guy who lives outside Pine Hollow, she continued. You're not just a mechanic who fixes cars and works long hours. Her voice faltered for a moment. You're a werewolf. Saying the word aloud still felt strange. Jason remained calm, his expression steady. Heather looked up at him again, her eyes searching his face. I mean, that's insane, she said, letting out a small nervous laugh. Werewolves aren't supposed to exist. That's something from horror movies. Jason gave a small shrug. And yet here we are. Heather crossed her arms and stared at the floor for a moment. I saw what happened in the woods, she said quietly. I saw those men turn into wolves. I saw you change. She looked back up at him. You can't expect me to just accept that overnight. Jason nodded slowly. I don't. Heather sighed and rubbed her temple. It's overwhelming, she admitted. Everything that happened, it feels like my entire life flipped upside down in one night. Jason stepped a little closer but kept his voice calm. I get that. Heather studied him carefully. A small question formed in her mind. Why didn't you tell me earlier? She asked. Jason leaned his shoulder against the counter. I thought about it, he said honestly. Heather raised an eyebrow. You did? Yeah, Jason replied. He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. But I didn't want the first thing you knew about me to be that I'm a monster. Heather frowned slightly. You're not a monster, she said automatically. Jason gave a faint half-smile. That's easy to say now. Heather tilted her head. So why wait? Jason looked down at his hands for a moment before answering. I wanted you to know me first, he said. Heather stayed silent. I wanted you to see who I am when I'm just me, he continued. Not the wolf part. Just the guy who runs an auto shop and lives in a small mountain town. Heather thought about that for a moment. Jason continued. If I had told you the truth the first time we met, you probably would have run the other direction. Heather couldn't argue with that. She gave a small nod. Yeah, probably. For a moment the only sound in the kitchen was the rain outside. Heather suddenly remembered something. You did drop hints though, she said slowly. Jason raised an eyebrow. Oh. Heather nodded. You said once that you were a lone wolf. Jason smiled slightly. Yeah. Heather shook her head as the realization sank in. I thought you meant it as some kind of metaphor, she said. Jason chuckled quietly. Nope. Heather sighed again. All this time you were telling the truth, and I just didn't see it. Jason looked at her gently. It wasn't your fault. Heather leaned against the counter again, feeling the tension slowly draining from her shoulders. Despite everything, Jason still felt like the same person she had known before. He wasn't acting like a monster. He wasn't threatening or dangerous. He was just standing there, watching her with concern in his eyes. Jason stepped closer again. There's something else you should know, he said. Heather looked up at him. What? Jason's voice became serious. No one is going to hurt you. Heather blinked. What do you mean? Jason's expression hardened slightly. The wolves you saw in the woods, they're not the only ones out there. Heather felt a small chill run through her. But as long as I'm around, Jason continued, no one's touching you. Heather studied his face. There was no hesitation in his voice. He meant every word. You're serious, she said. Jason nodded. Completely. Heather felt something inside her chest loosen. For the first time since that terrifying night in the woods, she began to feel safe again. The tension that had been building between them slowly faded. Jason stepped closer until they were standing only inches apart. Heather didn't move away. She could feel the warmth of his body and hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing. Jason reached out and gently brushed a strand of red hair away from her face. Heather looked up into his eyes. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Jason leaned forward and kissed her. The kiss was slow at first, soft, gentle, but it quickly deepened. Heather felt his arms wrap around her waist as he pulled her closer. His lips moved against hers with growing warmth and confidence. Her heart began to race. For a brief moment she hesitated. Everything that had happened over the past 2 days flashed through her mind. The wolves, the fight, the shocking truth about what Jason really was. But despite all of that, she didn't pull away. Instead, Heather slowly placed her hands on Jason's shoulders. She kissed him back. The fear and confusion she had been feeling didn't disappear completely. But something stronger was growing in its place. Trust. And for now that was enough. The kiss between Heather Whitmore and Jason Callahan ended slowly, not all at once. For a few quiet seconds they stayed close in the kitchen, breathing the same air. The rain still fell outside, steady and cold against the windows, while the dim light from the stormy morning made the room feel private and still. Heather's hands remained on Jason's shoulders, and Jason's arms were still around her waist. Heather looked up at him, her heart still beating fast. Everything between them had softened. The fear that had been sitting hard in her chest was no longer as sharp. It had not disappeared completely, but it had eased. Jason was still the same man standing in front of her. He was still the man who had held her, kissed her, and looked at her as though she mattered. But then something else hit her. It came suddenly. A deep, powerful hunger twisted low in her stomach so fast that she almost gasped. It was not mild hunger or the kind a person ignored for an hour. It was strong and urgent, like her whole body had suddenly remembered something important. Heather pulled back slightly and pressed a hand against her stomach. Jason noticed at once. What's wrong? He asked. Heather frowned and looked down. I'm starving, she said. The feeling only grew stronger as she stood there. Her stomach felt hollow, painfully empty, and the need for food rose through her so sharply that it almost made her dizzy. She tried to think of the last time she had eaten anything. Then she realized it. She had not eaten for over a day. The truth hit her all at once and she blinked in disbelief. After everything that had happened, after the chaos in the woods, after sleeping for so long in Jason's bed, she had completely lost track of time. No wonder her body felt like it was demanding something. Jason looked at her face and then let out a short laugh. Heather looked up at him. What? She asked. He smiled in a way that was half amused and half knowing. Little wolf girl's hungry, he said. Heather stared at him. Don't start with that again, she muttered, though she did not sound angry. Jason only looked more amused. I'm serious, Heather said. I feel like I could eat everything in this house. That bad? He asked. Yes. He gave a small nod, like that answer made perfect sense to him. Then let's go get breakfast, he said. Heather glanced toward the dark window where rain streaked down the glass. Now? Jason raised an eyebrow. You want to stay here and starve? Heather gave him a look. That's dramatic. Jason shrugged. So is holding your stomach like the world's ending. Despite herself, Heather let out a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. The hunger twisted again, stronger this time, and she knew he was right. Staying in the house while her stomach screamed at her would only make things worse. Fine, she said. Breakfast sounds good. Jason stepped closer and placed his hands lightly at her waist. Heather had almost forgotten that she was still sitting on the kitchen counter from earlier. Before she could say anything, Jason lifted her down easily as though she weighed almost nothing. Her feet touched the floor. The movement was quick and natural, but it still made Heather look up at him in surprise. "You know," she said, "it's a little unfair how easy you make that look." Jason's mouth curved slightly. "I'll try to look less impressive next time." Heather rolled her eyes softly, though a faint color rose in her cheeks. He moved toward the door and she followed him. The house was quiet except for the storm. Jason grabbed what he needed, and within moments they were ready to leave. Heather pulled the oversized hoodie tighter around herself as they stepped outside. The rain had not stopped. It fell hard and cold, turning the yard slick and dark. The air smelled of wet earth, pine, and distant fog rolling through the trees. Heather hurried beside Jason through the rain, and he stayed close to her the entire way. Not just close. Protective. There was something unmistakable in the way he moved with her now. He kept his body slightly angled toward hers as if shielding her without even thinking about it. When they walked, he stayed near enough that she could feel his warmth despite the cold. They left the house together and headed into town. By the time they reached the Timberline Diner, the parking lot was already packed. Cars and trucks filled nearly every space. Rainwater had gathered in puddles all over the gravel lot, and people moved quickly from their vehicles to the front entrance with heads bent low against the weather. The diner's sign stood out against the dark sky, promising hot food and warmth inside. Heather felt the hunger again the moment they pulled in. It sharpened at the thought of food. She could almost imagine the smell already: coffee, bacon, toast, syrup, fried potatoes. Her whole body seemed to wake up at the idea. When they got out, Jason came around to her side without hesitation. Heather noticed it right away. He did not simply walk beside her. He stayed close enough that anyone looking their way would immediately understand something about the two of them. Jason kept Heather near him in a way that was calm but clear. His hand settled at her waist as they moved toward the entrance, guiding her through the crowded parking lot. It was not rough or controlling, but it carried a message. She was with him. Heather felt it in his body language, in the easy certainty of the way he touched her, in the way his attention stayed on her even while his eyes scanned the people around them. There was something deeply possessive in it. Not cruel. Not forceful. Just deeply certain. Jason acted like a man who already knew exactly where she belonged. At the diner entrance, they found the lobby crowded and noisy, so after checking in, they stepped back outside to wait beneath the roof overhang. The wooden overhang gave them a narrow stretch of shelter from the rain. Water streamed from the edge of the roof in shining lines, splashing onto the gravel below. The weather had turned the whole morning gray and heavy, but under the overhang, with the wall of the diner at her back and Jason beside her, Heather felt oddly insulated from the storm. Jason stood behind her after a moment, then drew her gently closer. Heather settled back against him without thinking. His arms came around her easily, surrounding her with warmth. The rain beat against the roof above them, loud and steady, but close against Jason. The sound began to feel almost soothing. Heather let herself relax into him. His chest was firm at her back. His body heat sank into her through the damp, chilly air. His scent, clean rain, woods, and something darker that belonged only to him, wrapped around her in a way that made her feel strangely calm. For a little while neither of them said much. Heather could hear the storm. She could hear the distant murmur of voices near the diner door. And beneath all of it she could hear Jason's heartbeat. Slow, steady, strong. The sound grounded her. She listened to it while he held her there under the overhang, protected from the rain by the roof and protected from everything else by the man standing behind her. Every beat reminded her of his presence, of his strength, of the strange safety she felt when he was close. Heather closed her eyes for a moment. Her hunger was still there, sharp and real, but now it mixed with something else, something quieter and deeper. The storm raged around Pine Hollow, but in that small space beneath the diner roof, with Jason's arms around her and his heartbeat steady behind her, she felt anchored. And for the first time since the terrifying night that had changed everything, Heather let herself lean fully into that feeling. Heather Whitmore stood beneath the roof overhang outside the Timberline Diner, listening to the steady rain and the strong, even beat of Jason Callahan's heart behind her. The storm had not weakened. Water poured from the edge of the roof in silver lines, splashing into the gravel below. The sky remained heavy and gray, and the cold air smelled of wet earth, pine, and smoke drifting faintly from somewhere nearby. Jason still held her close. Heather had stopped fighting the comfort of it. His arms around her felt steady and warm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her thoughts had begun to settle. The fear and confusion inside her had not vanished completely, but they no longer rushed through her the way they had before. Standing there beside him, she felt grounded. Then Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. The small sound broke the quiet between them. Jason loosened one arm and reached for the phone. Heather turned slightly so she could glance at him while he checked the screen. His eyes moved over the message and then he slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Our table's ready," he said. Heather nodded. The hunger that had been twisting in her stomach flared again at the reminder of food waiting inside. Jason guided her gently away from the wall and toward the diner entrance. Even that small movement carried the same quiet certainty he had shown all morning. He did not rush her. He simply stayed close and made sure she stayed beside him. When they stepped through the front door, warm air rushed over Heather's skin. The inside of the diner was crowded and loud. The lobby was full of people waiting for tables, shaking rain from their coats and talking over one another in a dozen overlapping conversations. The smell of coffee, syrup, eggs, and fried food filled the room so strongly that Heather's stomach tightened again. Jason moved with easy control through the crowd. His hand settled on Heather's waist the moment they entered. It was a simple touch, but it stayed there as he guided her through the busy lobby. He kept her close to his side, his palm warm and steady against her through the oversized hoodie she still wore. Heather was suddenly aware of how many people filled the entrance, how narrow the space felt, how easy it would have been to get separated in the crowd. But Jason made sure that did not happen. Every step he took said the same thing without words. "Stay close." Heather noticed the way he positioned himself as they moved. He stayed slightly between her and everyone else. Not in a dramatic way. Not enough for most people to notice. But she noticed. His protective instincts had not relaxed even for a second. His attention remained sharp. He was leading her to breakfast, but part of him seemed to stay alert to everything around them. Heather glanced up at him while they walked. There was nothing soft or uncertain in the way Jason carried himself. He moved like someone who had long ago accepted responsibility for more than himself. That calm strength surrounded him so naturally that Heather felt it even when he said nothing at all. And strangely, instead of making her nervous, it made her feel safe. She realized it fully as they crossed the lobby. Safe. The word came to her clearly. She felt safe beside him. Not because the world had become less frightening. Not because everything suddenly made sense. The truth was the opposite. Her world had become stranger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. Nothing about the last 2 days had been normal. And yet, with Jason's hand at her waist and his body close enough to shield hers, Heather felt protected in a way she had never felt before. She did not fully understand him yet. She did not fully understand what he was. But somehow she trusted the way he stayed close when she needed him. She trusted the way his body always seemed to move toward danger instead of away from it. She trusted the look in his eyes when he promised she would not be hurt while he was around. That trust sat quietly inside her now as they moved deeper into the diner. All around them, plates clattered, voices rose and fell, and the warmth of the crowded restaurant pushed back the cold, wet morning outside. Heather had no idea that far beyond the diner walls, beyond the warm light and the smell of breakfast, something darker had already entered Pine Hollow. She did not know that Ray Whitaker was already in town. Neither did Jason. Neither of them knew that the hunter had come into the mountains with purpose, patience, and a plan. While Heather followed Jason through the crowded diner, Ray Whitaker was somewhere in Pine Hollow thinking only of the hunt ahead. He had already decided how he would begin. He would not search blindly through miles of forest. He would not waste time chasing rumors without direction. Instead, he would start with the one clue he trusted most. The red-haired girl in the photograph. Ray believed the girl would lead him exactly where he wanted to go. He had studied the image too carefully to doubt that instinct now. The man in the picture was too large, too commanding, too unusual to be mistaken for anything ordinary. Ray had spent years tracking creatures hidden in human shape, and every bit of experience he had told him the same thing. The man was an alpha wolf. And the girl behind him mattered. She was not random. She was not passing through the woods by accident. She belonged close enough to him to be useful. Ray intended to use that. In his mind, the red-haired girl was no longer just part of the photograph. She had become the key to the entire hunt. If he could find her, watch her, and learn where she went, then sooner or later she would lead him to the alpha. And once Ray found the alpha, the hunt would begin in earnest. He was already preparing for it. Every part of his arrival in the mountains had been deliberate. The hidden cabin. The rifles. The dogs. The supplies. The conversation with his local contact. None of it was accidental. Ray did not move carelessly. He prepared. He waited. And when the moment came, he struck. Somewhere beyond the storm, he was laying the ground for a deadly hunt. A hunt that neither Heather nor Jason could yet see coming. Inside the diner, however, the world still felt ordinary on the surface. Heather followed Jason between closely placed tables and booths, past waitresses carrying coffee pots and families gathered over steaming plates of food. The normal noise of the place wrapped around them. Nothing in the room hinted at the danger quietly growing outside it. But that was what made the moment dangerous. The calm. The false sense that this morning was only about breakfast and shelter from the rain. Because even now, while Heather felt safe walking beside Jason, the future had already begun shifting into place around them. A hunter had come to Pine Hollow. He had chosen his prey. He had fixed his eyes on the red-haired girl. And somewhere between the hidden cabin in the mountains and the crowded warmth of the Timberline diner, the path between Hunter and Alpha had already begun to narrow. The conflict had not yet exploded into violence. No blood had been spilled. No challenge had been made. But the movement toward it had started. Quietly, surely. Like the first roll of thunder before a storm breaks open. Heather did not know it. Jason did not know it. Still, the truth remained. The hunter was in Pine Hollow. He was preparing. And the road leading him toward the Alpha Wolf had already begun. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more interesting stories.